Great. Thank you all for joining us here today to dig deeper, question curiosities, and give more context to the outstanding work in pink signage. If any questions, comments, or thoughts come up for any audience member, we encourage you to use the chat to pose a question, share a thought, or even compliment one of the artists. I want to ask that everyone ensure that their mic is muted for the duration of the panel. I am Chris Reeder. I am Chris Reeder, a first-year graduate student in the Visual and Critical Studies Department here at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I am honored to welcome the folks who are here now, the folks who will watch this in the future, and our featured artists to this panel discussion. To give insight on the show, Pink Signage uses a diversity of materials, including paint, textiles, translucent mylar, embroidery, and physical objects to represent the layered and intricate relationship each artist has to power structures, resistance, and their understanding of truth in society. Through each piece, Olivia Minshall, Ruth Poor, Jiaming You respectively use their work to catalyze conversations on societal expectations and to interrogate structures of power imbalance as they each bring social histories into the contemporary moment. As art theory is often linked with sociological thought, as concepts like positionality give audiences a deeper understanding of who the artist is and why they create the work that they do, positionality describes how your identity influences your understanding and outlook of the world. Thus, I love to start the discussion by learning more about the primary influences of each of your work. How does positionality or social positioning guide your practice?
I'll take this one first. Hi, my name is Olivia. I am from the suburbs of Chicago. I grew up in the Y2K, early internet, mobile kind of digital age. And in suburbia, we were kind of saturated with this kind of sensational, colorful sense of pop culture. It was like pink curly font. And you had to care, were you team Britney, were you team Christina, like, were you NSYNC girl, were you Backstreet? So all of these things felt important. They were all highly gendered, but they felt important at the time. And I think my positionality in the space inevitably introduced me to the power dynamic and authority of gender binaries. So growing up in a very patriarchal environment, full of double standards and misogyny. Like, I was thinking, like, who doesn't love a good dumb blonde joke? Like that was such a big thing. It was, now stupid, but like totally misogynistic. And kind of parading and condoning the objectification of women, but simultaneously scrutinizing promiscuity. So in these kind of formative years, high school, junior high school, you felt like, surrounded with all this, stimulating content, you felt like as a young girl, I was like, I think I want to be objectified. I want to be wanted. You kind of, which is a confusing thing when things like sexual assault and rape and various forms of manipulation become involved and then become overlooked because of the inherent kind of superiority of a man's word. And that pissed me off. That made me really angry. And I guess kind of segueing, I then read a book in high school called Catch-22. One of my favorite teachers, Mr. Matthew, recommended it to me. And the book is about the absurdity of war and life, and it's tragic and sad, but it's funny. And that part where everything is broken and nobody wants to stop and listen or fix anything, that line of everything's fucked and it's also funny made me make sense of the world around me. So my work is guided by the line between humor and pain as a woman who's just here to raise some hell. Mm-hmm. So reading Catch-22 was my villain origin story, as I'd like to say.
Yeah, I can go next. So hi, I'm Jiaming, and for me, there are multiple biographical identities that comes into my work, and sort of shape, like through personality and social positioning. And I was born in Shanghai, and I always grow up in metropolitan environment. And I'm also the only child of a nuclear family. But simultaneously, I am a single immigrant who came to the States just by myself without my parents 9 years ago to the States. To me, because of this multiple biographical identities and being the only child, and I feel a strong disconnection to the traditional inherent value system, like the one we were talking about, how people are gathered through their shared nation identity, like being the everyone being the citizen of this country, or everyone being members of this like church group or this large family. For me, those value doesn't directly apply to me. Um, Instead, I feel myself more believe in the individualized, multifaceted, context-based presentation of identities. I believe that people, individuals, have the right to define what they think, who they are, and how they want to present, despite sometimes we're using the same umbrella terms for calling the identity. I believe there's an individualized, context-based interpretation of the identity, quote unquote, norms. And I believe it's the power comes to everyone to define who they are. In my work, there's always those aesthetics come from the urban street scenes or graphic, like cyberpunk or sci-fi kind of vibe, the Frankenstein of the body and machine, and it comes from me try to reflect on how individuals try to fit themselves into the larger social structure, but still struggle to find their own voice and their own uniqueness. And also, you can see quite often reflected in my work the relationship between different physical components. And I always put them together through some kind of way of assembling that is fluid rather than fixed and still. Because to me, identity is something that we learned through our personal experience, and we can unlearn or like pick up or decide to dump if we find it fit or unfit. And I believe that is truly the power and the freedom of individuals to define their own identity.
Mhm.
Yeah, I will answer next. Yeah, in terms of my identity, and how that informs my positionality or social positioning in my work, um, I've I've broken down to a few elements that I think are more closely related to my work here. Um, I'm from rural Indiana. I've lived in a rural area the majority of my life, 25 years, 26 years. And then I moved up to Chicago, um, 8 or 9 years ago. So I've been up here for a little while in the Aurora area, so the far west suburbs. But being from rural Indiana, and just living in like rural Iowa and different places like that has had a pretty heavy influence on um, just what I saw visually and a lot of the cultures that are tied within rural and often agrarian landscapes. I'm from a split class hometown. I would consider it split class. There's a small university in the town that I grew up with, and then that's usually occupied by wealthy North Side Chicago kids, and that being paired with a rural landscape was always of interest to me and always brought a bit of strife to our community. And I would go as far to say I'm from a split class family as well. I'm also from a multi-generational household. So my grandparents raised me. My grandmother still lives with my parents. So I always had family around that were caretaking for me. And each of those things informs the way I interact with, you can't see my mouse, but that's okay. Like the toile de joy that I have shown on the left-hand side. It's kind of cropped into two, thanks, Jiaming, into a few different sections here. This print in particular is actually in my parents' house, but it's one of the more recognizable toile landscapes. The imagery itself has is old enough that it's considered to be a common source at this point. So you can find this print basically anywhere in different colors and sizes. But that material, I think, ties into each of those parts of my identity that I mentioned. One, the rural representation. I grew up not seeing a lot of contemporary artwork. I was more used to seeing things like this. My parents are interior decorators. So it comes back into this generational attachment that I have to my hometown and my family as well. And then the split class, that pairing of high and low, I think of toile as being representing poor people, laborers, peasants, and accessorizing them within wealthy homes. So this material, I think, really works within those categories that I see myself as being socially positioned within.
Thank you each for sharing. The show does a great job of revealing each of your personal narratives with the audience, and I love how the show brings many current conversations into one space. Whether we consider theories on power by French philosophers like Baudrillard or Fanon, many figures across intellectual and art circles understand the value of art as an opportunity to question society and be the forefront of change in norms, hegemony, social expectations. And as I think of your work, each of you touch on your own experiences with structures of power and influence in society. So I would love to know how your presented work and practice critique systems of power.
I'll take this one. I think we all can very much just speak on this. But I would say the systems of power that I mainly critique, I think I can break them down into three. The first being like the man, kind of in its all-encompassing meaning. So kind of challenging systems that are already in place, like academia, like the workplace, like social dynamics, like social expectations. I have an issue with that. I have an issue with what is, with what should be without an explanation, because it's always been like that isn't good enough, and it's also just not an answer. So like for instance in the art world, and you have to stretch your canvas, it has to be straight. Most of my stuff is unstretched and or cut up I don't know, there's that. But I would say that the second, and debatably one of the trickiest ones to navigate is kind of an interesting product of toxic masculinity, which is the system of what I describe as women versus the woman. And it's kind of like the stereotypical, you're watching a movie and it's like a gang of girls comes over and bullies, one girl. That's kind of the dynamic that I mean. And it's kind of a formula that falls into a lot of categories with, judging other women based on whatever it might be, but it's also just kind of a self-sabotaging behavior, and it has to be unlearned is what I've learned, because I found myself on both sides. I've been the woman and I've been the women, and that's something that you have to take a step back and question why you're doing what you're doing. And that's kind of the inherent nature of toxic masculinity, that it has kind of trickled down into the way that women can communicate with each other. And this final system of power, trying to think of the best way. I think just the system of yourself, right? It's kind of like yourself versus yourself. It's this internal dialogue, like I was talking about before, that you have to kind of stop and think like, oh my God, I think I have to unlearn that. That's a terrible behavior. That's a terrible way to approach something. So it's this kind of this good and evil battle of nurturing and harm. But that's definitely a system that I critique, in kind of a mental health kind of section. I've chosen this piece. This piece is called Hysteria for Chickens, which I think hits all three of these systems. The first being just the term hysteria was historically used to medically diagnose women as mentally ill. And I had to look this up, but it was because of ungovernable emotional excess. Ungovernable emotional excess. So we can't control you, so something's wrong with you. What? Like that to me is already out of bounds. And my work was recently described in 2022 as hysteria. And this piece is in a commentary, or in, I guess, a reaction to that. It's in a Barbie font. It's like a bajillion hand-placed rhinestones. It's chicken wired over. It's the woman kind of caged by this continuation, this word that can, refuses to leave. So yeah, I mean, this is going to live as it's going to live. And maybe it is hysterical. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it's not. But that's all.
I'd also love for you to answer, or I'd love to hear from you, Jiaming, about how you feel your practice critiques systems of power.
Sure. So my work usually critiques systems of power through overlapping physical and psychological spaces. So in the current slide, I'm presenting my work titled 1 Pound, including material of ready-made speed bag, ready-made boxing gloves, and metal chains, and painted vinyl images. For me, I include ready-mades or objects to symbolize the physical circumstances or locations. As you see, like boxing gloves and speed bags, items you would use as spotting equipment when you go boxing. And boxing is my hobby. So when I see those, it brings me back to the boxing gym or the boxing ring that I do my daily practice. So I see them as symbols for the location and also for the physical action. And for installing, you could argue that the metal chain is just tools for, or hardware is just for like suspending the objects and keep them in place. But in my object label, I clearly list metal chains as one of the materials used for this piece. So you can see the duality of chains, that they are playing both as restrictions and also like stabilizing forces. And that's something I think of all the disciplines of power, of system of power quite often. Because I like reading philosophy by Michel Foucault, and one of his big book, Discipline and Punish, talks about how the society or the people with power using punishment as a tool for discipline. And when I think of punishment, I not only think of like all the physical like torture. I also think of lack of freedom, or like restrictions in behavior, or restrictions in movement and traveling. As an immigrant, when I sign up or when I attempt to keep any kind of my visa valid, I feel like I'm signing a contract to agree a certain protocol of behaviors. That would include like what kind of work I'm allowed to do, or if I ever allowed to work, and if so, how many hours per week I get to allow to work, and what type of work. All those restrictions sort of reminds me that there's this discipline going on associated with the identity of me being an immigrant. And because of that, I'm not having enjoyed the full freedom as someone who's a state citizen would enjoy, like the freedom of traveling, or the freedom of getting to pick the kind of jobs available for them. So that indicates the power, and people with power have the right to define what the norm is, and they would set the rules for the restrictions. And those norms and those restrictions are tools that they use to discipline people who doesn't have as much power as they do. So looking back to the chain, the physical things they do are multi-sets here. Like they're the suspending tool, and they are also the thing that defines where each piece is going. Thank you.
And I love how you all, when you mention the structures that you're critiquing, you're rooting it in your everyday experience with your art, experiences in your fitness routine, experiences in your studio or in your crit circles. That's why analyzing all of your work, Audre Lorde's quote, "The personal is political," rings really relevant. And so I'll ask you, Ruth, how does this quote resonate with your practice, and what personal politics are illuminated through your pieces?
That's a great question. I actually think it's somewhat a continuation of the previous question for me. So when it comes to, first, one thing I haven't addressed so far is my relationship with gender, and considering that's a very large overarching connection between our practices. I wanted to mention that first, because it is very much a relationship between the personal and political, at least in the environment that a lot of us live in, whether it be rural, urban, suburban. We experience very different levels of it and different situations, but it's still a framework in which we're trying to push against. Like Olivia, I also, in a lot of my work, analyze the policing of women and femme peoples by other women. So I'm also very interested in those dynamics as well. And I think it's a hard line for me to walk across, because at times it seems that I'm being almost overtly misogynist in my attempts to critique that sort of patriarchal set of systems and limiting by other women. So it's something that I explore through my work, and it's sometimes I know how I feel about it at the end, and other times I'm not quite sure what the relationship ends up being. Other than that, I think politically speaking, I'm very interested in revisionist history and colonial history as well. So like some of the work I was showing between both the toile piece and the one next to it that uses a lot of the same materials. I'm interested in breaking things down, specifically colonial history or history that's been presented inaccurately, and breaking those down in order to create possible futurities, but not necessarily for myself. It's in the hopes that it makes space for other futures other than my own to have a platform to work from. And so it's important for me to have almost this violent erasure that's involved with my work as well. So I guess all of those things, along with my social positioning that I mentioned before, that's what I think that quote means to me, is how all of those things that wrap up our identity, how they push against frameworks that are provided to us.
I love that you mentioned futurity, because as we critique systems of power, we're reworking definitions and systems of normality as we know it. And it makes me think of this ongoing conversation in the art world and beyond about silence as a form of resistance. Researchers like Maggie McClure and Christina McRae trouble this idea of one's voice being the epitome of power. And as you each work out of the paint department and use paint as your medium, you silence your physical voice in place of using art as your voice and tool of communication. So with that duality of auditory silence, but also expressing the loudness throughout your work, I want to focus on Olivia's work. I'm interested in your opinion on what do folks unlock in their experience and their refusal to be silenced?
I love this question. If there's a piece in the show, it's called Rat Bastard. And I think I'll just start with the story of it. I think it will wrap things up nicely. I had these studio shoes and I loved them. These ones on the right here. And they were a little bit cloppy, a little bit clippy, but they were my like fun shoes that I would come into the studio, change into. And one day somebody was like, "Oh, I really love your shoes." I say, "Thank you." I thought it was like, you know, a compliment. I don't know how else you would take it, but so I continued to work. I pace when I work. I'm clipping and clopping around. And the next day I come into my studio and they're not where they always are. They're always under my locker. They're on the other side of the room. And one of this middle bit of the shoe and this far right bit of the shoe used to be one shoe. So the sole had been ripped out completely and placed on the floor. So it was this very intentional, very kind of, in my kind of cowardly way of asking me to not wear these shoes. Just come and tell me next time. But so this initially made me feel sad. It made me feel meek and small and embarrassed, which is such an emotion that I hate feeling as a woman, that I feel sorry or embarrassed for doing things that are fucking normal. It makes me, it's infuriating. So obviously I feel these feelings first. And in previous discussions, I talk a lot about the tangibility of female rage. And this is it. So I had to make a piece about it. I wasn't gonna sit and, hot glue my shoes back together. This needed to be said. I needed to say this. And the female rage is it's like this, it's anger and it's sadness, and it's all of these feelings of like, sometimes you feel isolated or less than you should, or you feel misunderstood. But the greatest and most empowering part of that is the complete lack of hesitation that I feel when I'm like mad. Like there's something so powerful about that, and being so decisive. And so back to the actual question of, refusing to stay silent and silence in my work. What I've unlocked by making this piece is the confirmation for other people who maybe didn't know they needed a nudge or whatever to say something, to validate that it's totally cool and it's totally okay to say something. Hey, rat bastard broke my shoe. He did. It did. But I think in learning and relearning to become a confident woman, artist, person, human, I had to learn to trust my gut. And this is an awesome thing, because while I picked up the shoes, and this is totally true, right? I picked up the shoes, and my first thought was like, my shoes are broken. My second thought was, I am so angry, but so calm, cool, collected. I'm going to screw these into the wall of the gallery. This will be a piece. And that was my first thought, or second thought, I mean. But look, I screwed them into the damn wall. So you can break my shoes, but you can't keep me quiet.
Right, you can break it, but you can't get rid of them.
Yeah,
they live forever.
You can't get rid of me.
Right. And thank you for mentioning behind the scenes of your work. Thinking about pieces from ideation to actualization, I want to be sure to discuss the layers that exist within the show. As a curator, I'm constantly questioning, what do layers add to a piece? What value and meaning do they add? And why to layer or why not to? Thus, because all of you add multiple layers of physicality to your pieces, how do these layers extend or build upon your intended message?
I can take on that one. So for me, multiple layers of physicality always exist in my work, and I think of I approach the thinking process through like 3 different levels or 3 different aspects. First of all, I want to remind my viewers that absent of physical material also sit as a very important point on the spectrum of layering, because I use so many lighting equipments in my work. There's so many shadows from different light resources cast on. I always think shadow a very crucial and organic part of my work, because it allows interaction that is non-physical between components that are not physically attached to each other. So I'm thinking of it's a silent conversation through the lack of physicality. And for me, that serves almost as a metaphor. That context belongs to the larger picture, or it points to someone's multiple identities that talks to each other, although someone is playing only one role, so there are many social roles. what I'm thinking as example would be many artists and gallerists and curators, like all those titles belong to one person, and they share the biographical identities, multitudes, as I do. Like they could be someone from India, immigrant, and so someone simultaneously, someone as a person of color, and just someone from the queer community, and someone who has some connection to other gallerists and collectors. So they start to initiate their own gallery business, and their multiple identities reminds them the importance of take care of people who are marginalized. So they start to initiate all the gallery projects focusing on artists of color, artists from the LGBTQ community, and artists who are immigrants. When they present themselves as gallerists, they don't necessarily also emphasizing that they're immigrants or they're people of color, but thinking of other identities would help or would shape how they behave when they behave in their professional field. And second, I always think like for viewer, I want to reward them for viewing and interacting with my work. So I usually do it through craftsmanship and aesthetics, and often using familiar objects. For example, in this chaser piece, I have window blinds, and that's a very classic and easily accessible symbols objects suggesting domestic space. So that would give viewer an easy access to the context that is, I intend to be heavier, but having a familiar objects in the installation would give viewer an easier time. And third, I would always think multiple layering would allow juxtaposition of different contexts. And when I talk about juxtaposition, I'm thinking of it as a gesture that challenges norm, because juxtaposition to me means things or concepts that doesn't normally belong to each other. So when I put the chainsaw there, I'm very aware of myself being a women artist, and I'm also aware of chainsaw being a tool that mostly used by carpenter or people who work in the workshop, and presumably mostly men. So I think of it as my power move to put a chainsaw and to let it swing. Let me start the video. You can actually make the chainsaw swing through a light pole on the fishing wire that holds it. So yeah, there's the chainsaw, and I'm also thinking of the male genitals, or at least the shape would suggest that. So it's like a woman having access to the male sexual genitals, and it's both erotic and aggressive and funny. Thank you.
Yeah, I can talk about the layers in my work too. If we could actually go back to the slideshow, my slide has the one piece I included that is in the show, I think addresses some of this, and it probably has a lot more layering, or at least visible layering in this piece. This is a step before completion. If you want to see the real piece, you still have a whole day to go to the MFA show, so definitely drop by. So this painting that I have here, I was thinking of it in a few different ways. I first started thinking about layers in a geological sense. So layers of time and history just being built up. So as you excavate some of these layers or peel away some of the fabric, you'll be exposing new layers underneath. And so I think about that literal stacking of time and being able to work into it as being both sort of destructive, but also exposing a literal layer of made history that's underneath it. And I try to think about that a bit more conceptually too in this piece as well. Recently, we had a visiting artist, Mark Bradford, who said something about his work that I found really interesting, in that he has a certain refusal to start with a blank surface. And it's something that I've intuitively done the same thing, but I couldn't really understand why. And his mentioning of this, I felt validated my own exploration of starting with a either a found object, whether it be printed or it's printed myself, as a means to look like an already worked slate instead of starting with a blank canvas. And I think of that because it's almost like a given history, or it's something that's inherited, and it lays as the framework to my lived experience that I'm stacking upon it. So those layers over time, they become important as your own line work as an artist builds the space, but also having mixtures of found imagery, almost like an heirloom or an inheritance that you're working with. The layers in this painting specifically ended up feeling more like there was a relationship to the body, which I didn't fully realize until I was complete with it. It's built on a Luan door that doesn't have the board hole where you would have a handle. So this is just the plain Luan that you can purchase at like a hardware store. So it was laminated upon that. So the relationship of the door to the body, I found, I thought was really engaging and interesting. And then I started thinking about the layers of the fabric as being like layers of skin. So then the toile that was printed, it's the same print on each of the layers that are stacked beneath it and above it. So as you peel away a top layer of fabric, you find that it's the exact same pattern that's underneath it. And so then it became kind of like skin, but also like a tattoo of having this certain permanency. No matter how many layers are removed, it's still embedded in flesh in a way. And a lot of the cutting was involved in that. And so it became much more violent in my mind by the time I was finished. So the layering for me sort of depends. Like in this instance, it did become more about the body. But like my first two mentionings of using those multiple layers, I like to think of it as relating to time and history and our relationships with those things as we work through our painted process and how we interact with those.
Thank you all for all the insight you gave to your pieces. I retweet what Ruth is saying, that tomorrow is the last day, and make sure you go out. If you haven't, even if you have, go out one more time before it's deinstalled. We're heading into our last question, so I want to invite the audience to send any questions they're considering. And while we wait for that, I want to first congratulate each of you for your amazing work and dedication, Going to SAIC, a top 2 school for painting and drawing, isn't easy. Going to grad school amidst many world-changing events isn't easy. And you all have prevailed and risen to the occasion and produced such beautiful, relevant, and innovative work, speaking to topics that are personal, but also so relatable. So in addition to expressing my gratitude, and I'll kick off this Zoom round of applause for you all, I'm eager to ask, what are the next steps for each of your practice?
I can take on this one first. I have been planning my post-graduation and applying for residencies and open calls for exhibitions and magazine publication. So currently I'm in a virtual residency with Oxford Art School, where I had an in-person show in January, in winter. So currently I'm working with curator Addison Blee. She is a Black curator focusing on public art and discussing, like helping artists achieve their work through the complex social structures and the complex power hierarchies. She's based in Houston, Texas. So the virtual form of residency really helps to bring people from different locations to sit together, like virtually. And I also have some magazine publication coming up soon. And I'm gonna share more details when they finish editing all the poetry, literature, and also my paintings.
I'll jump in. Yeah, also like Jiaming, I'm applying to residencies, and it's kind of nice to have this show basically finished, because then I can spend the rest of the semester trying to see how I, hopefully with much grace, leave this school. And yeah, applying for jobs. So if you're hiring, give me a ring. Yeah, personally with my work, I'm interested in continuing with a lot of the subject matter I've been working with. I'm also trying to find avenues in which I can create programming or opportunities for people, whether it be in the Chicago area. I plan on sticking around here for quite a while. So I'm trying to build my relationship and understanding of the city. But I also want to be able to give back to my hometown as well. I always compared people leaving from small towns to the big city is like this big romanticized gesture. And I think it's very similar to a relationship of crop rotations and how we leach nutrients from the ground, and it's really never returned. And so I want my interaction with my community that I grew up with to be something of a nurturing, I don't know, sort of integration. But other than that, I just want to take a second to thank a few people too who've like really helped me get to this point, and hopefully I can continue with after. I feel like I've been here since post-bac year, and I have like a million people to thank. So I've had like so many advisors: Sam Jaffe, Jim Lutz, Dan Devening, Phyllis Bramson, Susan Kraut, Christine Tarkowski, Jade Umang, Suzanne Doremus, Mary Lou Zelazny, Frank Piatek. I can like keep going. And then other people that I just keep around as mentors too: Matt Morris, Jason LaFountain. I annoy all of these people so much, and I appreciate them letting me do so. And I guess thank my dad too for helping me build my giant embroidery hoops. So yeah, that's all the thoughts I have in my head.
How do I top that? I think, yeah, similarly, I think I'll start by thanking people first. I think that's, before I forget, like supportive friends, family. My parents let me paint in their attic, and they didn't tell me I was weird to my face, but they let me get through. They let me do what I needed to do. So they definitely saw that awkward phase, but I just so appreciate support since then. It really does mean a lot, and SAIC has been so incredible in finding a nurturing environment for that I think that we're all trying to kind of grapple with and navigate through. I mean, we're both, you know, trying to find our voice in art as well as our own. And I think that this place has been incredible for it. I was also in the post-doc program with Richard Hall and Susan Kraut. And I've worked with Maury Eastman and Mike Cloud and John Thomas Henderson. But I really think my deadly duo was Galen Gerber and Jim Lutz. They brought me down, they built me up. That I really found, yeah, they really nurtured what I needed to say. They're all for the language that I was using. And shifting to the actual question of what's next, moving to London in the fall, and bringing my art there hopefully clicks. I think the language will probably click. But yeah, I'm excited to see where the art wants to go. I think that's the most important part, of just kind of going with the flow.
Thank you all. Of course, sending all of the best wishes to each of you. And I'm sure you will all have amazing careers globally, internationally, in all spaces, traditional and non-traditional, that you choose. We do have a few questions in the chat. I guess we'll start with this one. How has the pandemic affected your work?
Nobody wants to take this one. It's hard. This is a hard one. It's a really hard one. Ruth, your mic's on. Why don't we just all talk about it?
Why don't we all just cry together, and
Yeah.
that'll be a great expression of how the pandemic has affected our work.
I think so.
No, it's funny because Olivia, for a long time, I didn't know you were a post-bac. And so the three of us all had a post-bac experience that overlapped the before times, before, COVID started. And so for me, I think the biggest difference was moving from a space and a certain expectation of like class dynamics. And by that, I mean like within classes, within our school. I felt like at that time I had a very close relationship to the other people I was working around. And since the pandemic began, that sense of community that I had before has been entirely dissolved. And I think there's only so much supplementary Zoom meetings that we can do to make up for it. And I think there are a lot of us artists that are, wanting to safely move forward, but definitely anticipating an environment that we can all come together and experience one another's work and thinking processes and influence one another. I think that's been the biggest difference for me with the pandemic.
I think that you summed it up pretty concisely. I think another really tricky obstacle was just space. And that does something, I think, mentally as well, not having access to your materials, or, it's tricky. I mean, it does something. I think I knew that I had hit a wall when I started pouring glue into small boxes, and that's all, the only room I had. I had small boxes from Amazon, and I had a tub of glue, and I'm like, is this seriously what I've come to? Is this what art is? It's challenging, but it makes you think, constantly keeps you on your toes, I think. It's been interesting.
And you all have touched on so many ideas. I want to wrap up by combining two questions in the chat with one: how has SAIC transformed you as an individual? And what advice do you have for folks considering an MFA in painting at SAIC? Not a trick question.
Can you repeat that? I'm just going to write down so I don't forget.
Yes, of course. As we talked about your practice, the audience is interested in how SAIC has transformed you as an individual, and what advice you have for folks considering an MFA in painting at SAIC.
I say do it. I didn't even know I wanted to be a painter until I started painting. And then I just kind of was like, why not? Why not apply? Why not try and pursue this thing? So I didn't come from necessarily an immediately artistic or painting background, but this is something that if you feel passionate enough about, this place will transform your career in a like an inward sense. Like it will make you feel like an artist. You don't have to read those books that say, like, self-help, how to be an artist. Like page 1, like, tell yourself that you're an artist and say it out loud. It's like this, they make it feel like the real deal. Not they make it feel, they make it the real deal. And that you can't explain that. It's amazing.
I'll go next. Yeah, SAIC overall, and I hear this from so many people, and then I hear an apology that they're saying something that 900 other people have always said, that their MFA experience has always been a transformative experience for them. And I definitely think that for myself as well. The people that I've met here, the long list of people that I just mentioned, plus just as many more, have been really influential to me as a thinker, especially, but also as a maker. And being able to have the privilege to be in an environment like this, where you're able to pretty freely exchange ideas, to visit one another's studios, to have professors come visit you. That sort of network and support has really been invaluable to me. And as someone who wants to stay in the Chicago area, it just seems kind of smart too, just to know more about the people that you'll be seeing, hopefully, outside the school post-graduation. And yeah, MFA for painting, go for it. It's fun. The painters are pretty open to incorporating other media now into painting. And so it's fairly interdisciplinary. The whole school seems to be moving in that direction. And I really appreciate the excitement and the willingness to explore those avenues within that department as a whole.
Yeah, I already echoes with what Ruth just said, because as you can see from this presentation, like my work is pretty interdisciplinary. And when I was enrolled, I guess my panel didn't know that I can paint other than like I can do something other than like making standardized oil painting on stretch canvas. Like now I don't even use stretch canvas anymore. So it was a complete shift. So I guess my suggestion is don't limit yourself. Like don't mentally think, oh, I'm in painting program, so I must make something that can be defined as a painting. Like don't restrict yourself by thinking that way. Like use whatever media that interests you, use whatever media that makes sense to you, and feel like you can feel free to explore and not feel the stress or obligation to commit yourself to only one media, because that actually just limits your practice. And also I would say talk to people who doesn't feel directly associated with your practice. Like the reason I get to know Chris and invite them to be our lovely curatorial advisor and our co-panelist is because I met them in the open call for like a curatorial like open call for the opening studio. So I would say just attend as many school-wide event as possible, and don't limit yourself to, oh, I only gonna talk to other artists. Like talk to people who know theories, talk to critics, talk to curators. Yeah, talk to as many people as possible, make connections.
Well, I hate that time has already passed by so fast. What happens when you're having fun and you're comfortable? And I'm honored that you guys chose me to be a part of this. And I want to thank everyone in the audience again, now and in the future, for staying with us for a little past an hour. We appreciate you, we thank you, and we could not do this without you. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Jiaming. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
It was amazing. Mwah.